Well, as Mike said, I am the dirt guy. My kids call me the dirt doctor, which is fine with me. A lot of people in my field of endeavor bristle at the idea of calling soil dirt. I actually like the word dirt, frankly. Soil sounds too academic and sterile to me. I mean, dirt is what you want, right? You want to get in and you want to work with it and you want to play with it. And really, the word dirt implies something that's maybe not perfect and in some kind of flux. It's changing all the time, and really that's the way our soils are. They're not a nice little inert bunch of stuff that we can, really predictably know all the time how it's going to respond. And so it's got a little bit of a mind of its own, and a lot of that comes from the fact that it's a living, breathing tissue. It's not just this inert stuff that sits at the surface of the earth. It's made up of a bunch of mineral and organic matter mixed in, but it's teeming with life. If we look at a definition of soil, or dirt as we might rather call it, it's not just the weathered rock and organic matter up there, but it's there's a living part associated with the mineral part that we need to take into account. And I literally mean that it's a living, breathing tissue. If you go out and grab a handful of this stuff out of your garden or under your turf or something like that, you're holding it in your hand, you're holding anywhere from 15 to 20 billion organisms, okay, just in that little handful of soil. It's teeming with life, and we can't separate that living component very easily from the physical part of the soil. It's a system, and it works together. And in order to support plant growth, which is really what we want to do with this soil material, we have to account for keeping the living part of it functioning well too. And so we're going to talk a lot about that as we go along. Everything in the natural environment that surrounds us, that's even in us and part of us, living things, plants, animals, humans, and so forth, at one point or another cycled through the soil. The soil touches every other aspect of the environment, the atmosphere and the biosphere and the hydrosphere and everything else. And we derive most of what we need in terms of nutrition from soil materials. That's why I call it, philosophically, the foundation for life. People will say, well, no, water owns that distinction in the natural environment, but you can't live on water alone for very long, because the stuff that's really nutritive to us in the long run are the dissolved mineral nutrients that come from our soil materials primarily. So those are the things that, kind of comprise this big picture view of the soil. So we're going to take a look at how these develop in the landscape a little bit, and then we're going to focus in on properties that are common to all of them, and how maybe we manipulate some of those properties to make them work as a medium to support plant growth. All soils, regardless of where we find them in the natural environment, derive originally from some parent material, the rock or sand dunes or other things that might be washed or blown into a given area that settle in at the surface of the earth. Primarily from the rock, we get these smaller and smaller particles that then accumulate at the surface in this unconsolidated mass, and then that begins to interact with the natural environment. We get changes in water content, temperature fluctuations, input of activity from animals and plants and other things with that, and it begins to take on some characteristics different than the original parent material. It's altered in some way from the original parent materials. And as it does, it develops then from the surface downward. So this rock will continue to decompose and break into smaller and smaller pieces, and we'll get this accumulation of additional or unconsolidated material as that changes with depth over time. If we take any of that volume up there, just a shovel full of soil anywhere around the world, we'll notice some interesting things about it. Fully half of the volume is void. It's pore space. It's open and can be filled with water or air to varying degrees depending on the conditions. And that's a really important aspect of these soils. That becomes a storage and an exchange mechanism with the natural environment for the exchange of gases, the storage and retention of water for later use by plants and animals in that system. And people find that pretty amazing to realize that fully half of that volume is open pore space. The other half of the volume is solid material, most of which is mineral material derived from those original parent rocks and other things that the soil was derived from. There's a little bit of organic matter mixed in for good measure, and we'll talk about how important that is later on as we go along. But this says 5% in your notes. That's an average across the continental United States or so. How much, does anybody know, do we deal with or enjoy here natively in our soils in Utah? Yeah, 1 or maybe 2%. Some places you might find pockets where it gets a little higher than that, but rarely more than about 1.5 to 2% in Utah. So we in the arid west of the United States have the distinction of pulling the average down there. We'll see some contrasting soils here in a bit where that pulls the average back up. But as these do develop from the surface down, the soil begins to develop in layers as it interacts with the natural environment. Changes begin to take place. The surface layer, we don't call them layers because that would kind of imply that they're easily discernible one to the next and when there's a nice even boundary, and there really isn't. These things are wavy boundaries. Sometimes the changes that take place we can't see with our eyes, and so we call them horizons as they change over time in response to the different soil formation factors that impinge upon it. The surface horizon is the one that interacts the most with the natural environment, has the most input of activity. It has the biggest changes in temperature and water content and things over time. And that surface horizon is typically what we all affectionately call topsoil. Okay? It's the one that's interacted the most with the natural environment. The rest of these horizons below are horizons of change, and there may be one or more of these B horizons which are have been altered in some way from the original parent material. This might be continued additional weathering from the parent rock, additions of salt or clay or other things that have changed its character from the original parent material. And then down deep in these profiles, typically if we find one that's fairly undisturbed, we can find at depth some remnant of the unaltered parent material in that system. But these other horizons below the topsoil, we generally just lump into a big category that we call subsoil. But there are some interesting contrasts in the properties of the topsoil with all of the other horizons beneath it that we lump into the subsoil category. And regardless of where we find soils across the world, the topsoils are going to have a similar set of properties in comparison to the subsoils, and we'll see that as we go along. Now don't look at your notes for a while, because the way this thing prints out, it steals the thunder of the question, okay? It answers the question ahead of time. We're going to look at some of these soils as they've developed around the country and get an idea of maybe the environments under which they developed. All of these are going to be exposed soil profiles with depth, and the scale on them is all in feet. So here's a backhoe cut that we've looked at and cleaned up, and it's 4 feet of soil depth that we're looking at here. What's the first thing, the most dramatic thing that really jumps out at you about this soil? Yeah, how even and consistent it is. Somebody else said the color of it. That's the one that really grabs me, is that deep, dark upper topsoil horizon there. Wouldn't we all love to have that in our backyard? Okay. This soil is about 10% organic matter in the upper reaches of the topsoil, and that's a lot higher than what we would ever deal with here. And that fingers down into almost 3 feet as that horizon then begins to give way to the ones below it. What causes that dark black color up there? What's that?
Plant decay.
Yeah, decayed plant matter, organic materials, animal bodies, and other things that might have been left behind in there. And so this has to be an environment that supports a lot of plant and animal life, okay, in the soil. It would have to be a fairly humid environment with a lot of optimum growing conditions, and in fact, this is the case. This is a soil that'd be very telltale of the corn belt of the United States in the humid areas of the upper Midwest, where you have a lot of organic matter, in this case tall grass prairie lands, that put down copious amounts of root mass in these soils over time and have supported enough plant growth that it doesn't have a chance to completely decay before the next plant cycles come in. So it accumulates over time to a high extent. Now this soil is a little bit different. It's not nearly as dramatic in terms of its darkening of that topsoil horizon, but even then you still see it's a little bit darker brown up in the top foot or so compared to the lower horizons. But the thing that really jumps out to me anyway in this one is this zone down here, 2.5 to 3 feet or so in the soil, where you get a bunch of these deposits of white crystalline material. What might that be? It could be rock, but it's powdery stuff. It's the crystalline stuff. Yeah, salts, lime. In this case, it's gypsum, another calcium salt that's been deposited in this soil. So if we look at maybe the history that's recorded here of the environment, we have an environment that supports a fair amount of plant growth because we can see the organic matter accumulation that just happened natively in this particular soil. And we've received enough water to leach a lot of the solutes out of the upper couple of feet, but not enough that it's pushed it on way down below. That other soil we saw here, we can go tens to hundreds of feet before we get to anything where we might see accumulations of solutes or even into the parent materials.
Like old river bottom type.
Yeah, well, these are like really deep soils on glacial till or something, and this one's not. So an environment that has enough water received to support the plant life, but not enough to really wash the whole profile clean. And that's very common in the transitional areas in the country, going from our humid areas to the semi-arid areas like in eastern Colorado, western Nebraska, the shortgrass prairie type soils. I was on the faculty at Colorado State University for 14 years before I came back to Utah about 10 years ago. And this particular soil is, halfway between Fort Collins and Greeley out on the Front Range of Colorado. Ah, beautiful Utah, right? Okay, yeah. So we don't see a whole lot of accumulation of organic matter in the surface, not at least visibly here, even though it is there. Not a lot of native plant growth supported because our environment is just too dry to support a lot, and we grade really rapidly into fairly unaltered parent materials at shallow depth in these soils. So, you would say, well, this is a fairly undeveloped soil, but regardless of the fact that this is, not as nearly developed as maybe that one in the upper Midwest, there's still some similar properties to the topsoil in this one compared to the subsoil, and we'll take a look at that here in a second. I've thrown another one in here that says Central Utah. That's down around Millard County there, actually, that one. I threw this one in to kind of play with our minds a little bit. This soil, yeah, if you're anywhere on a rocky slope in the state, you'll find similar kinds of soils. But this particular soil, really what we would call soil material, only amounts to about a foot sitting on top of the bedrock, the granite, partially decomposed granite here below it. You see almost no horizonation, no layers that are developed in here, and no real organic matter accumulation at all. Although, sitting on top of this soil is about 2.5, 3 inches of organic debris, leaf and bark and other litter that's sitting on the surface of the soil. And this is really common to our mountain conifer forest soils around here, where we have a lot of pine and fir and other things in the mountains. So what do we know about that debris that's underneath a pine tree or a fir tree? What's it made up of? Pine needles, pine cone, bark, and things like that. Very, waxy, cuteness, lignous kinds of materials, lots of resins in them that don't break down very easily. They don't break down very fast. And when they do break down, and give us the soluble organic materials, they enter the soil. And what did we say about this material? It's not just mineral matter, right? What else is there? Yeah, lots and lots of organisms, and they might be a little underfed in this particular situation. And so as soon as that organic matter comes into it, which is food for them, it's burned up really fast. And so it doesn't have a chance to accumulate in these soils, and we don't see that happening. But this also gives us maybe a little bit of a segue into talking about the importance of soil conservation and keeping the resource in place. You can imagine that in this fragile environment, a little bit of soil loss is really detrimental to the productivity of the system, because the plants that are in this material really don't have a whole lot to pull from, right? They've got only a little bit of area to proliferate their roots. There's really only a small area for exchange of water and gases with the environment and so forth. And so if we lose a little bit of soil out of here, we really can damage the productivity of this environment. It's pretty fragile in that sense. We may not have been, at least in an urgency sense, too concerned about a little bit of loss from that upper Midwest soil, right? Because, oh gosh, we've got 3 feet of this rich topsoil. I lose a little bit, who cares? Well, it still has the same effect, maybe in not in the same magnitude, but it takes a long time for an inch of topsoil to develop and to regenerate in an area where it might have been removed. In fact, here's a dinner party conversation starter for you. How long does it take for an inch of topsoil material to develop on average across the country? The answer is best encapsulated in a poster that's on the door of one of the professors in the biology department. It says, the things that have happened since the last inch of topsoil developed. And it goes back in a kind of a historical perspective thing, a big long list, recent elections of living presidents, and back into I Have a Dream speech, and back into the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln's tenure, and it keeps on going, a Revolutionary War, and boy, read this, you're kidding me. And at the bottom of the line it says, Columbus discovers America. Wow. So you're talking a little over 500 years that it takes for soil or an inch of soil to develop at the surface of the earth. So it does make a difference if you lose some. It's hard, yeah. It's hard for the soil to redevelop in those areas. Okay, so let's take a look at this thing that I was telling you before. Regardless of where these soils develop, even the kind of wimpy ones we have here in the state of Utah in terms of topsoil development, we still have some bulk properties that are similar. The topsoils will all generally have higher organic matter level, because they interact the most with the environment around it. They get the most input of plant and animal activity. They typically are lower in solute content because they've received more water than any other profile layer, and so they're going to be washed a little bit more than those other horizons. And they're higher in nutrient content for a couple of reasons. The organic matter that's there breaks down and releases nutrients back to the system, and the surface of organic matter is charged, and so it can attract nutrient ions to stick to it and be retained there for later use by plants and animals. And so typically it's higher in nutrient content because of the retention capabilities too of that organic matter that's there. The subsoils are typically much lower and maybe even devoid in some cases of organic matter. They typically are higher in clay and lime and salts and other things that can be translocated with water down through the profile that accumulates there. And they typically are higher in pH overall. Am I too loud? Okay. It's got to adjust my levels so I don't blow people out. When they you went down on it? Okay, that's fine. So what happens when we do this in Utah? Yeah. We grow a lot of basements in the state of Utah, and we pull that material out of the hole and we pile it up alongside the house. Is that more subsoil or topsoil? It's a lot more subsoil than it is topsoil. What do we do with it? Yeah, we spread it around and we pack it down really good, and then we give the homeowner in an HOA covenant 1 or 2 years to establish a landscape in that mess that we've just given them. Okay, so we need to take that into account, and more, to their credit, the construction industry and the landscaping industry and things pays attention to that. And they'll stockpile the topsoil and they'll return it, or at least give you an option to pay to have it returned back to the location to try to kickstart that soil profile back into the best or at least optimum performance in the shortest amount of time. That's important for us to pay attention to. And if you have anything to do with a new build or a managed landscape or something like that, you can pay attention to the properties that are acceptable for a topsoil material. If you're trying to make sure that the topsoil that's there has good properties, you can go to the extension website, and I don't know if Mike's talked to you about that yet. Have you? Okay. So extension.usu.edu. If you go there, there's the publications link, and you can search on any topic of interest that you might have in gardening or soil and other things that we're going to talk about tonight. If you search topsoil quality, you'll pick up this document, and there's some tables in there that give you some of those properties. We'll not be able to cover all of them tonight. We'll talk about a few of them as we go along. All right. So we've looked at the development of soils kind of in bulk in different settings.